The isolation from world affairs that Americans had hoped for and clung to was shattered. America was thrust into a war it didn't want, a war it had desperately tried to avoid. But on that day, the long, dark journey through the hell of World War II had begun. American citizens didn't know what to do. They didn't know what to think. They knew they were angry. Suspicion immediately fell on those of foreign ancestry. German and Italian Americans were looked upon with deep suspicion. But that was nothing like the way that Japanese Americans were looked upon. Better than 110,000 American citizens of Japanese descent were deprived of their property, deprived of their liberty, and deprived of their dignity at the hands of the United States government without even the due process of law. What do you remember of the time when Pearl Harbor?
Well, I remember that on a Friday before Pearl Harbor, I was really thought that I was an American. When I came back on Monday, I wasn't quite sure. But my dad always said, we are an American, so I believed it, and...
Those were dark times for our nation. It was a time when American citizens had to prove they were American. It was a time when American citizens of Japanese ancestry would fight for the country they loved, would fight for the government that had abused them, would fight to hold their sacred honor. Let's take a ride. I've been called a rebel, and I am a country boy. In the months following Pearl Harbor, most Americans of draftable age swarmed the military recruitment depots. They were itching for a chance to get even with the Japanese Empire. They understood the war would be long and costly, but they wanted to do their part, and young men from every corner of the nation lined up to do their duty. Everybody, that is, except the Japanese Americans. The Japanese surprise attack, the dastardly sneak attack as President Roosevelt had coined the phrase, cast a pall of suspicion upon everyone of Japanese ancestry. In a knee-jerk reaction after Pearl Harbor, almost overnight, most Americans became suspicious of anything Oriental, and the phrase "a Jap's a Jap" was heard time and again. What were Japanese Americans supposed to do in the face of this new wave of prejudice? Were they Americans or were they Japanese? And for some, that was a hard question to answer. And when the government of the United States, the nation you call home, takes away from you the one thing that makes America truly special, your freedom, the question becomes even more difficult. These American citizens were denied their right to due process. They were herded from the West Coast to relocation centers, ultimately to be incarcerated in internment camps. They were forced to sell their homes, their farms, their property, and most importantly, they were robbed of their dignity, robbed of their honor. How could this have happened in the United States of America? Well, it didn't happen overnight, but it did happen. From the very beginning of Asian immigration to the United States, there had been prejudice. Federal law prevented Asians from becoming naturalized citizens, and almost every state had laws that prevented non-naturalized people from owning or inheriting property. This pretty much cut the Asians out of society altogether. There had been years of exclusion laws and quotas that said how many Asians could actually enter the United States at all. Following the attack on Pearl Harbor, this climate of prejudice culminated in President Franklin Roosevelt signing Executive Order 9066. He signed the order on February the 19th, 1942. This executive order gave the War Department authorization to designate strategically important military areas. The right of any person to enter or leave the zone was at the sole discretion of the military authority. Now, Executive Order 9066 doesn't refer to people of Japanese ancestry specifically, but it becomes the basis for curfew laws, exclusion orders, and ultimately the mass incarceration of tens of thousands of American citizens. In all, better than 110,000 people of Japanese ancestry, including 70,000 native-born American citizens, would be summarily removed from their homes and told to gather at an assembly center. Now, these assembly centers were hastily put together at fairgrounds, racetracks, and places like that. It's there where the Japanese would be processed and then shipped off to the various internment camps that were located around the country. There were 10 camps in all. They were spread around the nation, put in the most barren, backwoods places you could find, places nobody'd want to be. Places like Jerome, Arkansas, Hart Mountain, Wyoming, Gila River in Arizona, and Topaz in central Utah. Conditions at the camp varied widely, but none of them would be mistaken for a five-star hotel. Security at the camps was run by the military police. The camps were wrapped in barbed wire, and most of them had guard towers. The government argued that the camps were for the protection of the Japanese Americans. But all the guns were pointed inward, not outward. Just who were they protecting? The camps were all under the supervision of the WRA, the newly created War Relocation Authority. The WRA wanted conditions at the camp to seem like a normal life, a regular community. They built hospitals and schools. They sponsored camp newspapers. But pretty much conditions at the camp were ugly, cramped, and primitive. The WRA would have loyalty checks of the internees. Those that were deemed to be disloyal were either locked away in special WRA prisons, or they were cut out and isolated at the Tule Lake Segregation Center in California. The conditions at Tule Lake were so horrific that it caused better than 5,500 native-born American citizens to renounce their citizenship. So, Judge, what did your family do before Pearl Harbor?
My father was the secretary of the Japanese Association, which is a self-help group for the Japanese community, and he helped the Japanese people in terms of interpreting and doing a lot of things that they weren't able to do because of language problems.
Right. Judge, how did things change after the attack?
Executive Order 9066 is what started the whole thing, and all the Japanese were told that they had to evacuate. If you had, I guess, 1/16 Japanese blood, you're to evacuate, and they kind of rounded us up, and I remember that, they assembled us at a certain location, and from there, we got onto the Army trucks, and, they took us, and all we could take with us was what we could carry in our two hands and what we wore. And we had to get rid of almost everything else, so we either sold it or gave it away.
That had to be a huge change.
It was.
Oh, gosh.
Well, especially where they sent us. It was, we're from California, and they sent us to Wyoming, to Hart Mountain, and that was,
there.
And I understand that in history of Wyoming, that was one of the coldest winters and earliest winters that they ever had.
So you were pretty angry.
Well, myself, not knowing what was going on, but the people who knew were really angry, and they just really kind of felt that, they were betrayed, by the country that they loved, and most of them have never been out of the United States. They don't know what Japan is about.
When the war ended and the camp system was eliminated, what happened? What happened to you? What happened to your families?
And as I mentioned to you, when we got out, they gave us $25 a ticket, and that was it. And we had to go And we returned to Ogden because that was the only place my mother had the relative. And, you know, we had to start from scratch with nothing.
With the benefit of 60 years, do you feel that, well, you individually, and I don't know how the Japanese American community, have you been able to forgive the government?
Well, I've forgiven a long time ago, but I've not forgotten, you know, my experience. And I try to tell everybody that it was tough, tough life, and that
We have two words that I can think of that were always talked about. And one is shikata ga nai, which means it can't be helped. But learn from the experience and move on. You lament too long and you will put yourself in a hole. So that and gambare, which is perseverance and persistence to do what you were meant to do.
Thank you, sir, very much.
Thank you.
Doctor, thank you, ma'am.
My pleasure.
Y'all have been a pleasure to speak with. It was an honor to have you on our show. Coming up on American Ride, the Nisei go to war. Now, while on the mainland, lockdown and relocation were the orders of the day, here in Hawaii, things were a little bit different. Now, number one, Hawaii at the time is a territory, and the federal government was hesitant to lock up Japanese American citizens. Number two, the flat reality is that the Hawaiian economy rested squarely on the backs of Japanese American citizens. Japanese American farmers, fishermen, shop owners, and laborers. If those people aren't here, the Hawaiian economy goes south. But the same curfew that was put in place on the West Coast came into effect here in Hawaii as well. And the incarceration of Buddhist priests and the overall suspicion of anyone of Japanese origin was a slap in the face to American citizens who'd been loyal and whose only transgression was that they'd been born of Japanese heritage. The treatment of the Hawaiian Japanese population here in the islands was much better than the humiliation and mistreatment that was inflicted upon the Japanese American population back on the mainland. But their fight for equality, their fight for honor, was no less difficult. After the bombings at Pearl Harbor, the U.S. government was suspicious of the loyalty of all Japanese Americans. And while young men of every other national background were allowed to volunteer for service, they were allowed to register for the draft. Young Japanese American men were classified as 4C. It's a notation that means enemy alien. Now, the commanding general of the Army in Hawaii was a fellow named Delos Edmonds. Edmonds would summarily discharge every individual of Japanese American heritage from the Territorial Guard. And he completely deactivated 2 whole regiments of the Hawaiian National Guard. Now, these young men, second-generation American citizens, called Nisei in their own tongue, they were hurt. These guys were crushed. Their government didn't believe in them. But rather than get angry and protest, the veterans of the Territorial Guard offered their services in whatever capacity the Army saw fit to use them. Now, this would mean menial labor, cleaning the grounds, shoveling the stables, building new buildings. But these men did their jobs without complaint. And they did it with diligence and with dedication. Now, because of their fine efforts and their hard work, General Edmonds changed his mind. He reversed his decision. In fact, he sent a letter back to the War Department in Washington, D.C., requesting that the Japanese Americans, the Nisei, be placed in their own special battalion. Now, the prejudice didn't dry up and go away overnight. It's true this unit would be sent back to the mainland for training, but they were also being sent stateside for safekeeping, just in case of another Japanese attack on Hawaii. Now, on May 26, 1942, General George Marshall signed the order creating the Hawaiian Provisional Battalion. On June the 5th, that battalion, consisting of 1,300 men and 32 officers, all under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Turner, set sail for the mainland. The Hawaiian Provisional Battalion landed in Oakland, California on June the 12th. The boys were activated that same day. The 100th Infantry Battalion was activated, but it's better known to history by its Hawaiian pidgin name, the 1 Puka Puka. In February 1943, the 100th Battalion was transferred from Camp McCoy to right here, Camp Shelby in Mississippi. They'd come to continue their advanced unit training. The 100th received top marks and an excellent rating in training. And it's because of their success that the Army decided to reopen military service to young American men of Japanese ancestry. During the 9 months that the 100th Battalion had existed, President Roosevelt and the War Department had been literally bombarded with petitions and interventions from prominent American citizens. They were requesting that young men of Japanese ancestry be given the opportunity to serve in the military. On February the 1st, 1943, the decision was made to activate the 442nd Regimental Combat Team. This unit would be made up entirely of Nisei, young Japanese American men, American citizens, all Nisei. In activating the 442nd, President Roosevelt used these famous words: "Americanism is not, and never was, a matter of race or ancestry." Chad Daniels, the museum director at Camp Shelby, took a moment to speak to us about the history of the camp and the Nisei soldiers who trained here. Chad, can you just tell us briefly what the history is of Camp Shelby?
Sure. Camp Shelby was established in 1917 to train soldiers for the First World War and has been used in all major operations except Korea since then. And today it's an active mobilization station sending soldiers to our overseas contingency operations.
Mm-hmm. I think it was in 1942, 1943 that when our government said that the young Japanese American boys could serve just like everybody else, they were sent here as well.
That's correct. The Army chose Camp Shelby as one of the largest training bases in the country at the time. However, it's in Mississippi, and then, of course, Mississippi had some issues for minorities at that time, and so there was a debate on, was it a good place to send them? And Mississippi declared them legal Caucasians to solve that problem. It was probably one of the best trained units in our military because they went through training in Hawaii, they went through training in Wisconsin, and they came here and trained some more, and then they finally got to go overseas. So they had a lot of training time.
Down.
Yes, they had training down.
Okay. And these fellows fought in Italy. They fought in
Southern France.
Southern France. They fought in Northern France.
Yep.
They saved a group of guys who were cut off behind enemy lines in Northern France.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, the extraordinary thing about that particular operation is they lost more men than they saved. And when they were told to go in, they had to pull soldiers from the service company, which is usually behind the lines maintaining things, and give them rifles and say, go up there, we got to get these guys out. And it was, you talk to veterans of the 141st Infantry, and they'll tell you we owe everything to those fellas because they got us out.
So these men earned their honor.
They did.
They never lost it.
No.
But they got everybody else to recognize that they're Americans. Well, Chad, thank you very much.
My pleasure.
Appreciate the words.
Absolutely. Thank you for coming.
In July of '43, the 100th Battalion received its colors, emblazoned with the motto, "Remember Pearl Harbor." It was time for the men of the 100th Battalion to set off and prove themselves. On August the 11th, 1943, they boarded ship and left for North Africa. At first, the 1,400-man unit was detailed the relatively safe task of guarding supply trains as they moved across North Africa. Colonel Turner knew that's not what those boys had come for. They'd come to Europe to fight. Turner was going to give them the opportunity to prove their mettle in combat. On September the 19th, the 100th Battalion arrived in Salerno, Italy. 10 days later, they were given the opportunity to lead the American charge up Monte Mileto. It would be the platoon of Sergeant CGO Joe Takata that would be the pointy tip of the American spear. Takata's platoon was moving up a narrow road that was bordered on one side by a deep gully and on the other by an olive grove. It was a perfect place for an ambush. And it wasn't long before German mortars and artillery were raining down on the young Nisei. Everybody grabbed as much dirt as they could. And then the German machine guns opened up. Sergeant Takata rose from his position, deliberately exposing himself to the enemy gunfire so that his men could locate the enemy machine gun. The young soldiers watched in horror as an enemy round hit their brave sergeant in the head and drove him back to the dirt. They watched as this gallant sergeant rose again, his face masked in blood, waving and pointing to his young soldiers. The Nisei of the 3rd Platoon rose in anger and went on the offensive, shooting, fighting, following the direction of their sergeant until the enemy gun was destroyed. Then the young troopers looked back for further orders from their sergeant. But he was no longer standing. Sergeant Takata lay slumped to the ground. The last drops of his Nisei blood, his American blood, stained the soil of Italy in freedom's defense. The 100th Battalion had its first Distinguished Service Cross recipient, and the young soldiers from Hawaii had lost their first brother in combat. Now, for its size and length of service, the 442nd would become the most decorated unit in American military history. It operated at a full strength of 3,800 men, but over the course of the war, better than 14,000 Nisei would serve in the ranks of the 100th Battalion and the 442nd RCT. Almost 9,500 Purple Hearts were awarded. 8 Presidential Unit citations were earned, and 21 recipients of the Congressional Medal of Honor come from the ranks of the 100th Battalion and the 442nd Regimental Combat Team. On December the 18th, 1944, the Supreme Court handed down a decision. They concluded that the exclusion process was more or less constitutional, but that loyal American citizens cannot be detained without cause. Seemed like the detained citizens were going home. The last camp would close in 1946. In 1988, after signing into law new civil liberties protections, largely based on the experience of the Nisei during World War II, President Ronald Reagan offered an apology. And in conclusion, he said, "Here, we admit a wrong. Here, we affirm our commitment as a nation to equal justice under the law." When you realize what these good people, these fine Americans, endured at the hands of their own government, you realize it's a black eye on the history of our nation. Nevertheless, these people didn't complain. They stood tall, and they served when America needed them most. And need them we did, along with all the young men who would fight against tyranny and oppression. And those battles were in full gear in Africa and Southern Europe. We'll see you next time on American Ride.